Good morning and welcome to the 20th meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2025. Before we begin, can I ask everyone to ensure that electronic devices are switched to silent. Our first item of business on the agenda is consideration of whether to take item 4 in private. Are we all agreed? Thank you. We are agreed. Our second item on the agenda is an evidence session with the Scottish Government as part of our considerations of the Natural Environment Scotland Bill at Stage 1. Today we will take evidence on Part 3 of the Bill, and I welcome to the meeting Mary Goujon, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands. And joining us from the Scottish Government we have Nicola Bradley-Martin, a solicitor, Brittany Brown, the policy lead, Jenny Gibbons, the team leader from National Parks, and Felicity Hollins, Deputy Bill Team Leader. So we've allocated around about an hour to discuss Part 3, and as usual we have quite a few questions to get through, so if we can ask for succinct questions and answers. So I'll kick off quite simply. What difference do you think the amended purposes that are being suggested will make in practice for national parks? So the impact of the amendments of the statutory purposes?
Well, ultimately what we've tried to do with the aims as they've set out is really modernise them. Some of the language has been simplified within them. I don't think it will fundamentally alter the work that our national parks do and what they deliver, but I think what the aims will do is better reflect the work that our national parks undertake. And I think it was really important as well with the addition of the subsection that really highlights the actions that are key to delivering those aims as well. And I think it also better reflects some of the key challenges that we face at the moment and our national parks' role in tackling them when we consider the biodiversity and the climate crises that we face. And that's the key aim, really, to introduce that language to better reflect the work that our national parks are doing.
Okay, so just for example, the existing Act talks about to promote sustainable use of natural resources. However, the aims in the bill suggest to promote sustainable management and use of the area's natural resources. What does that actually mean in practice?
Because I think when you consider because it isn't just about the use of our natural resources, but how they are managed, and recognising that our natural resources are managed. Although they're managed for climate, they're managed for nature, they're managed for people, and I think adding that really just better reflects the work that is undertaken as part of the aims.
Okay, thank you. Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Convener. The driver for an echo. Is that okay? Sorry, I was deafening myself as well as everybody else. And the driver for reviewing national park legislation was the strategic framework for biodiversity and to recognise the role of national parks in tackling the two twin crises. However, many stakeholders have described the changes as modest, and I wonder what impact Part 3 of the bill will have on national parks' ability to contribute to these big societal challenges.
Again, as I've already reflected in my previous responses, I think it better reflects the critical work that our national parks do in delivering for biodiversity, as well as tackling the climate crisis that we know that we face. And I think, as with anything, I know that there will undoubtedly be people that think that perhaps they could have gone further, and we're ultimately trying to get that balance between what we put forward in the aims of the national parks and also reflecting that against the other vital work that national parks do, recognising it's a place where people live and work. Again, I feel like with the modernisation of the language that we've got there, the addition of the subsection, I feel like, well, potentially we've got that balance right, but I am, of course, keen to hear the views of committee, and I'll be really interested to see what the committee recommend in relation to Stage 1. But I think that's also where the subsection is important too, because I think it picks out specifically how some actions will help deliver those aims, and I think it puts beyond doubt that these are aims actions that contribute to the 4 aims as they're set out.
Do you think our national parks have been delivering up to now?
Oh, yes, undoubtedly. I think in terms of tackling and doing more for biodiversity and climate, as well as for just more generally, I think for the communities that live in the park as well. When you look at some of the projects that have gone on in the park areas, the Cairngorms Connect, I think that's been doing really important work and bringing together different partnership organisations to really try and I think one real benefit of the national parks is they can do that at a landscape scale as well, and I think they have that convening power and ability to bring lots of different organisations and people together, which is really critical. So, and I think even when you look in terms of sustainable and regenerative agriculture and promoting that, I know that both parks have had pilot projects with farmers and land managers working within those areas as well to try and encourage more nature and climate friendly farming too. So I think all of that has been really positive, and they have been a real driving force in helping to try and tackle some of those big challenges.
Thank you. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to you all. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Some stakeholders have questioned the intent behind adding cultural development in addition to existing wording around cultural heritage, and suggested that this could be better differentiated, for example, around supporting the creative sectors. So what is the intention behind this change, and could it be clearer perhaps in the bill?
Well, there is, cultural heritage is defined in the 2000 Act, which and it states that it's structures and remains resulting from human activity of all periods, language, traditions, way of life as well. I do think adding the development and the cultural development element of that is important, because I think it takes it that step further, because it's not just about sitting still and appreciating what we have. I think it's all about how we can further develop that into the future as well. So to me that also means looking at, well, how can we help develop the creative sectors as an example? Does it mean supporting, well, it could well mean supporting other community projects in relation to the creative sector, arts. So I see that as a positive step forward and a positive addition in relation to that. But again, if there are, I think, further definitions or changes to the language that committee members feel are needed, then of course we'd be happy to look at that, and keen to hear what recommendations members might have.
And would that link then with the legislation that hopefully we're about to pass, which is the Scottish Languages Bill? And so that promotes Scots as well as Gaelic as well, so that there's cross-portfolio kind of connections that could be part of this.
I think there could well be, and I think that's where that cultural development element would really come in.
Okay, thanks.
There's been some concern about actually what the definitions of cultural development, and some suggested that you should have considered alternative wording like creative or creative arts. Was there a reason or much discussion around why cultural development was used as a term?
I mean, I think hopefully I've been able to explain that in some of my previous responses, because I think the development and the use of that word suggests it's something to look that you are looking to encourage, much in the same way we would talk about economic development or sustainable development. It's about how we take it that step further. But again, if there are other suggestions on language, I'm more than keen to hear it. But I would like to think that we have the balance in that right in terms of more broadly what cultural development could mean. And as I say, it could be the promotion of the creative industries and sectors too included within that. And I think it is important though that we don't narrow that too far down, because I think broadly the aims in themselves, they are quite broad, they are fairly generic. That's for a reason, because it's so that they can encompass a lot of that activity.
Okay, thank you. Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, would you see that as including local food cultures as well? Because obviously one of the concerns around new national parks would be what does this do for food production? What does it do for the food economy? Is there a kind of cultural element to food marketing, I suppose you could say, but also kind of traditions and that aspect of it that could be brought out by a park under that aim?
Absolutely. I think if you're talking about food, to me that would actually fall under a few different elements, I think, of what we have in the aims, whether that's the cultural heritage, because I think it is important. It could be cultural development, but also the economic development that we have within the aims as well, I think would capture all of that.
Yeah, so if there was an aspiration to make an area a food destination and to bring together, restaurants, businesses, food producers, would that be seen as a kind of a cultural aspect as well as an economic?
I would like to think so, because I think it is really important, and I think it is, more broadly across Scotland, a really important part of our heritage and what we produce. So, yes, absolutely.
Okay. It's making me hungry.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant.
Can I ask if there's sufficient balance in these aims, the aims of the National Park, between protection of natural heritage and sustainable economic development of communities? For example, we were speaking to the National Parks, and both of them were very focused on housing in their plans, because there is a degree of the need for housing and people not being able to live within the national parks. Do you think the new aims actually reflect that within the functions of the national park?
I think that I feel that they are, and again, that's where I'm more than happy to get views if members feel that the balance isn't quite there. But I feel like, again, within the aims that we have, I do think it broadly captures some of those issues, because you're absolutely right. I think that is a huge issue which has been identified in the park plans in relation to housing, because we want to make sure that we have sustainable, thriving communities within our national parks as well. That's absolutely critical. But I do feel that that would be captured within the aims that we have them, and that we do overall have that balance there. And I think we also can't forget the overarching purpose of our national parks too, which is about ensuring that we are that the aims and the 4 aims that are set out there are collectively achieved, which I think gives them that equal importance.
The 4 aims, I guess, were hard fought. I remember back to the original legislation, I'm afraid to say, and they were hard fought to try and get that balance right. But given the additional focus on different areas, so you've got A to F of priorities, but F is the only one that's really looking at people's well-being. All the others are looking about the area, are looking about tourism, are looking at climate change, nothing really to do with the well-being of people. And I'm wondering if that could skew the balance of those aims by... Previously we had 4 aims, and they were equally balanced. Obviously the natural environment took priority. I'm just wondering if those sub-aims, the new sub-aims, could skew the balance.
I think they're really just more to show and to put beyond doubt that these actions that we're seeing there contribute to the aim. So I mean, they're not meant to be hierarchical. It's not putting one above the other in relation to that, but really just to highlight those actions. But again, if there's any more clarity you feel would be thought, particularly with your expertise in this area, which probably definitely extends beyond mine as well. But again, I think we've introduced this in a way that we feel strikes that balance, but that's where we're keen to get that evidence from the stakeholders that have responded to the committee, as well as from members themselves.
Okay, so you don't think there should be given both parks raised the issue of housing, you don't think we should be specifically looking at housing for the local community?
I then have to consider what that means, but I think it's fundamental to the general aims as well, even out with the subsection. To me, it's a given within that if we want thriving communities, that when you consider the 4th aim, looking at the promoting sustainable economic, social and cultural development. I mean, ultimately we need people living and working within our park areas to be able to achieve any of that, and a fundamental element to that is, of course, the delivery of housing, ensuring we've got adequate housing for people as well within that area. So I believe, in terms of what we've set out, that would be captured within there. I think we couldn't ever have a definitive list of every single action, and I think that is always the problem with a list, because it becomes, once you have something there, it could be a case of, well, more additions, or people feel like if there isn't something on the list, then that means it's missing from there altogether. So again, keen to get views on that, but I think that it is a key issue, but I think it would be captured by what we have set out.
Okay. So I suppose, slightly turning it on its head, what are you hoping to gain by the new sub-aims?
Again, it's just to highlight that, well, giving specific mention to some of the challenges that we face right now. So in terms of biodiversity, looking at climate change, also to highlight the point about recreation, how important that is, really just to show that these are specific actions that help deliver the aims.
Okay.
Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. It's just to pick up on what Rhoda Grant's saying about housing, for instance, we know that there are challenges in rural areas, and I'm thinking about housing and support the repopulation, which people say we need to address depopulation in our rural areas. So that would be part of the, if I'm looking at the aims, to promote sustainable economic, social and cultural development of the area's communities. And so housing would be critical as part of helping with the addressing depopulation.
Oh, absolutely. And I think in terms of the subsection as well, I outlined the importance of housing, you know, in helping to deliver the fourth aim there. But there's also, again, as Rhoda Grant had highlighted in the subsection, promoting sustainable development activity, which improves health, wellbeing, prosperity of individuals and communities as well. And I think housing and the delivery of that is intrinsic to helping deliver on these aims.
Okay.
I really struggle with lists. And I think even touching yourself, you create a list and the focus then is what's not on the list. But it appears from what you're saying that actually the objectives A to F are all a bit woolly, and actually we can fit anything into them. So nowhere does it mention housing, but one of the key issues are that when we hear the Cairngorms or the Loch Lomond stakeholders in that its housing is absolutely key, and when we heard about Galloway National Park, one of the concerns was about the housing, the cost of housing and so on. So, and I know you can fit it in, you can squeeze it into E, or you can squeeze it in, but there's no specific mention of it. So is there any point having these at all? Because if you can squeeze anything you like in, so it may well be housing, or it could be jobs that pay the living wage or whatever, are all important. But actually, are they really what the main aims of the national park are? And we'd be better just getting rid of the list altogether, because I kind of follow on from this as well, is there a priority? And you know, we've heard previously that there's not a priority, they're all important, but ultimately they do all go back to A, restoring and regenerating biodiversity in the area. That's a kind of overriding aim, or one of the most important aims of a national park. So, are they set in a criteria and a you know, so A is actually more important than D, E is more important than F, and is there a chance that planners, whatever, will use that list as a priority list to allow or disallow or encourage certain activities and not others?
No, and it shouldn't be interpreted that way, and that's certainly not the way it's meant to come across, or as being hierarchical in that way. And you know, much the same as the broader aims that we have across the four aims. Again, the overarching purpose of the national parks is to collectively achieve the aims together. The bill doesn't change the Sanford principle. That is the only way in which that applies in 9(6) of the 2000 Act, which means that if there is deemed to be a conflict between the aims, then the first aim is the overriding one. But again, in terms of the rest of them, in terms of the new subsection, the list isn't intended to be hierarchical in that way, or prioritising one above the other. I mean, I completely appreciate the arguments that you're making there about creating a list, and you know, I've touched on some of that myself as well, because it can become about what's not there. I do think it's important to at least reference biodiversity and climate change, and given all the work that's happening in relation to that. But again, more than happy to take the views of committee in relation to that. But I think by its very nature it can never be all-encompassing and capture all the actions. It's trying to strike that balance between being general enough that it can cover a lot of that activity without being too specific, but more than happy to get views.
So you would be open to potentially considering amendments that would add to that list to address some of the specific issues around, for example, housing, or jobs that pay the living wage, or whatever within the national park? Because again, there's scant reference to those who actually live in the national park. We heard previously, I think, from Rhoda Grant about visitors and tourism, but there's not a lot about protecting those who actually live in a national park. Does that need to be expanded on?
Well, again, I would say that the final point we have in the subsection there about promoting sustainable development activity which improves the health, well-being and prosperity of individuals and communities, I would like to think covers that, because, like I say, people living and working in our national park areas is absolutely a key priority. That's something that we want. We want them to be thriving and prosperous areas. So I would think it's covered there. But again, I'm more than happy to engage in discussions with members around the table about any potential amendments they would like to see, and obviously get advice on what any implications of that might be. But of course, happy to have those conversations.
Thank you. You just rang a bell in my head. Why prosperity of individuals? Because that raised a few eyebrows with stakeholders. What's your definition of prosperity of individuals?
Because I think it's important that we recognise, of course, thriving communities is important, but also people as individuals. And again, I think it's important that we pick that, that we reference that. But again, if there are views to the contrary, more than happy to hear it. But I think it's about communities, it's about the individuals that live within them. So I think being able to identify that is important.
Thank you. Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you. Good morning, panel. I've just locked myself out my laptop. Thankfully, I have a printed copy in front of me. Nature Scott had referenced the modernisation of the aims, and I think you touched on that in an earlier answer. But they also said that the additional list proposed would be useful in clarifying the intent of the aims, and that could be complemented by the preparation of a national policy statement on national parks. So does the Scottish Government intend to progress that recommendation?
I think, given the overarching purpose and the aims that we have set out in the legislation, and obviously that we're proposing to modernise and change with this bill, I think with that work we feel that provides the adequate purpose. We don't feel that there is a need to come forward with a statement as Nature Scott has recommended, because we do feel that the driving force behind our national parks and what they should be aiming to achieve is adequately set out in the proposals that we have and in the aims and the overarching purpose.
Okay.
Elena Whittam.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and to your officials. I want to explore the proposal within the bill to have a strengthened duty on public bodies to facilitate the implementation of the park plans. Now, we've heard from both national parks that they believe this is a positive move. We've heard from the Cairngorms National Park that previously have regard to it as quite a passive term, and actually putting a duty to help implement the plans would be a positive. But we did hear from some stakeholders that they had a concern that this could have a run into conflict with a public body's own statutory duties and functions. So I'm wondering, what is it that the Scottish Government would like to see fulfilled in practice with this measure, and what changes do you think that this will have?
I would hope that it builds on work that is, again, already happening across our national park areas. And I do think having that stronger focus and in terms of facilitating the implementation of the plans, I think it puts more of a focus on all the public bodies in relation to working to deliver that. So, again, I feel that that's an important element that we introduce to the bill. And I think it's also important to remember that our national park plans are not developed in isolation, and our national parks have to work with local authorities and other public bodies anyway in their development, and there's extensive consultation around that. And ultimately, it's up to public bodies to deliver a lot of what is set out in the plans anyway. I mean, we've touched on housing already today. So, and I do think that we have provisions in there too that also mean that will try and help with, well, I wouldn't perceive there to be too much of a conflict between what the national park plans are trying to achieve and the overall duties of our public bodies too. But there's also a section within the bill proposals which makes it clear that the obligation only applies as long as it's consistent with the proper exercise of that public body's functions as well, which I think manages that. But I do think, and I hope what had also come through the evidence that you're hearing from stakeholders, is about the strong relationships that that exists between the National Park authorities and other public bodies, and particularly local authorities. And it was also interesting to see as well in some of the evidence the committee received from some of the councils as well, welcoming some of these duties that we're intending to introduce.
Thanks for that. And I'm wondering, do you feel as if there should be a requirement put into the 2000 Act for park authorities to consult a wider suite of public bodies on its plan? Because right now we know that that feels like it's kind of restricted to local authorities, and if there's a new duty on wider public bodies, I think they all do feed in some way, but should it be explicitly perhaps widened to include further public bodies?
I'm happy to take views on that and get further advice on what that might look like and any potential implications of that, because as you've outlined, there is that close working relationship already, but as you rightly say, in the 2000 Act, it's only local authorities, community councils that are specifically mentioned within that, but I'm more than happy to consider that if that's a recommendation and see what that might mean. But again, it is work that is already underway.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, I'm thinking now just about the national park plans that we have, and I guess their kind of status as planning documents, as the guiding vision really for the local area, and how those could potentially be strengthened through this bill. So I don't know if you have any reflections there on park plans in particular.
Again, I do think with what we're proposing to introduce through the bill, builds on that strong partnership working that's already in place. And I think the real benefit of the plans is that, and again, coming back to some of the discussions that we've had already this morning, is about that overall convening power that the national parks are able to bring, the focus that they're able to put on these really critical areas to drive these plans forward. So I think that they're really strong and focused, help to put that delivery on, and I think with the measures that we're planning to introduce through the bill, I think it helps just make that even stronger and ensure that there is that extra focus on the delivery of what's set out in the plans.
Yeah. So there's obviously that duty then to have regard if it's a public body. Private landowners, though, private developers, less so. There's less of a requirement for them to actually abide by the park plan and to deliver it. Do you think national parks have got enough teeth to really deliver the objectives of their park plans when it comes to private landowners, when it comes to private developers?
Well, I think they have a lot of experience in working in that area, because I think, well, obviously the vast majority of the land across our national parks would be in private ownership anyway, and I think that they have a strong record of collaboration, of working with landowners and land managers. And again, the national park plans themselves have to be widely consulted on, and that engagement with all relevant people is really important. Another important point to remember as well is the regional land use partnerships too, which are about bringing together the public bodies, and each of our national parks has a regional land use partnership and framework, which is about bringing together all the different representatives to really help drive forward the priorities for the area. So I don't think it's necessarily about having teeth. I think it's about fostering that collaborative working and trying to ensure that everybody is pushing in the same direction.
I suppose the question is that actually working right now? So, I can see good things happening, where I stay in Loch Lomond, Trossachs National Park. There's a lottery bid, I think, going in £10 million for a landscape scale restoration project. But I also see some private landowners that are not bought into that, and there potentially is some, conflict between objectives with public agencies and that as well. So I'm just thinking back to that primacy of the park plan and where that really sits within this bill, whether there are more reforms that could be brought in to kind of strengthen the primacy of that plan. So, for example, if you had, say, a major development, obviously had a lot of controversy around Lomond Banks development at the moment, is it right that a major development like that would not automatically go to a public inquiry if it was contrary to the park plan? Where does the park plan sit in relation to developments like that?
Again, obviously, I think that would probably cut across into areas of planning legislation as well. So I'm hesitant to set out right now, what that could look like, or where, if if changes were to be made, where the most appropriate place for that would be. I mean, obviously, our national parks have different planning powers as it is, and should there be a creation of a new national park in the future, that would be designed to suit the National Park Authority's own needs. So, again, I think that would be potentially a lot more complex than something that could be covered in this bill.
Yeah, but it just seems that with that particular issue, I know you obviously wouldn't want to comment on the Lomond Banks development itself, but it seems to be an example of where there's a development that's in contravention of a park plan, but actually, you know, the decision-making over that is elsewhere, and actually even the process of gathering the evidence, having a discussion, having a determination on that isn't necessarily guaranteed within the planning system. So it feels like, you know, the park has planning powers, but actually they're just the same as any other local authority, and ministers can call things in. There isn't necessarily a requirement for a public local inquiry if something was in contravention of a park plan. I'm just coming back to this question about the primacy of the park plan again.
Again, I think it is really important, and as I've already said, it's about facilitating the implementation of the plan. I don't know how much stronger it could be made in relation to that without wider implications on other public bodies where that could potentially conflict with their own duties as well. Though, as I say, I wouldn't imagine that would happen, but there are provisions in the bill that help deal with that. I think the issues that you reference are more in relation to the planning system, though, which I think is where, it's, again, something that would have to be looked at in relation to our overall planning legislation as opposed to measures through the Natural Environment Bill.
Okay. And then we're obviously considering another day in this room the Land Reform Bill as well, and the provisions in there for land management plans. How would you see land management plans really, again, reflecting the vision of the park and the park plans?
Again, well, we were talking yesterday, and I think some of the amendments we covered were in relation to the local place plans and what could be in the land management plans. I think that was an amendment that was supported yesterday in what consideration they should give to local place plans. Again, in relation to national park plans, that's something potentially that we could consult on as part of the overall regulations and guidance that we'd be delivering for land management plans, and something that could be considered within that. But I think it's important we have that consultation and engagement on it.
Okay, so you would expect the guidance for land management plans to reference park plans, obviously where they exist, so that someone producing a land management plan would need to refer to what's in the National Park Plan in their area? Oh,
I think all I'm saying right now is it could well do, but I think that's something that we need to consult on and look at. But, I mean, again, if we're doing that with local police plans, potentially national park plans as part of that. But again, I think that would follow in more detail in relation to the guidance and the regulations we bring forward on the back of that. Yeah, I think that makes sense, because again, Loch Lomond and the Trossachs, I think just about every community now has a local place plan, apart from 3. I think they're aiming to complete that by the summer. So, you know, that local planning, that park planning, and then the land management planning, I guess, should all flow together and should be unified. And I think we would want to make sure, as far as possible, that with the plans that we're developing, obviously we don't want to be doing everything in a silo, and I think it makes sense where these things align. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Can I just follow on from Mark's question? The time that these plans are in place, or how often they're reviewed, do you think there's a potential for conflict if you have a local authority have an electoral cycle, and we also have national plans like the UK forestry standard that's set, but we have a forestry industry that really needs to plan 25, 30, 35 years in advance? How do you think the national park plans can deal with that to ensure that they're flexible enough? You know, whilst commercial forestry may not be a huge consideration in Sitka spruce type scenarios and in the Cairngorms, when the government comes to consider other areas, for example, consider the Galloway National Park, how can we be sure that the national park plans do recognise electoral cycles, the local authority, national plans like the UK forestry standard plans come in, and how can they interact to make sure they're flexible enough not to actually put off investment or divert investment away from local authorities when it comes to an election and budget setting scenarios? I mean, I would imagine, given the length of time that the national parks have
have had in terms of and their experience in producing their plans. That's not something that I've been made aware is a particular concern or that has caused issues. Because I think the park plans always start from the very premise of it's about that collaboration and engagement with the relevant public bodies, with the other authorities. So I think that because of the strong relationships and the collaboration that happens there, I don't see that in particular being an issue. Or I don't know if it's something the committee's heard in evidence.
Okay, thank you. Mark, could you finish your questioning?
I'm finished. Yeah.
Thank you. Evelyn Tweed.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary and panel. My question is about bylaws. Cabinet Secretary, what are the opportunities for use of bylaws in the national parks to tackle issues such as antisocial behaviour, public safety and environmental damage?
I think the bylaws, obviously we have bylaws in operation in Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park at the moment. I think it's really important that our parks have that ability and to be able to deal with particular issues. I know the committee heard evidence from the national parks in relation to that. I think we're also looking and currently considering a bylaw in relation to the Cairngorms National Park in relation to fire management as well. I think given some of the really significant issues that we've seen with wildfire and how that's an increasing problem. So I think our parks having that ability to be able to address these problems is really important, and I think it's a really powerful ability that they have to try and address some of those issues. And I think where they've been operating in Loch Lomond, they have been effective in that, and I think with the measures that we're looking to introduce in the bill will help the enforcement of those bylaws to be even more effective than it is at the moment. Because I think what Loch Lomond and Trossachs are trying to do there in relation to water safety, which is a really key concern, being able to address some of the problems that they've seen there has been really important. So I think that, yes, very much a beneficial power that our parks have, and again with the measures we're looking to introduce in the bill can only seek to strengthen that.
Thank you. Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. The committee heard support in principle for national park authorities to be able to issue fixed penalty notices in respect to bylaws, but concerns have also been expressed that this could detract from the role of ranger services in engaging with the public, providing education and support and voluntary compliance. So is there a risk that having powers to issue fixed penalty notices would detract from the ranger services role?
I certainly don't think so, because I think that the Rangers have a really important role in the national parks. I think because, and ultimately I think what the fixed penalty notice regime would do is really just give them that extra tool. We know that it can be really cumbersome right now for the national parks in terms of enforcement because of that route that they have to take to referring things to the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. But I don't see the addition of fixed penalty notices as changing the role of Rangers. I think it gives them an additional tool to try and tackle some of the issues that they can see experiencing on the ground. And no doubt you'll have heard in evidence from the National Park themselves, I think just about the training that their rangers go through. I think that that's really, really critical in this. I think, you know, as ever, enforcement is always a last resort. You don't want to be the starting point. But I do think it's really important that they have the ability to do that, I think, rather than the system as it operates at the moment, which I don't think really gives them that ability to tackle some of the issues they're seeing as effectively as they could.
Swifter action rather than waiting for the enforcement procedure that there is available at the moment.
Yes, absolutely. And you would hope that that would also potentially act as a deterrent if people know that a fixed penalty notice and that they can be given that. It could then deter, again, behaviour that we wouldn't want to see in our national parks. But I do think Rangers, the role of them in educating and having those conversations with people is still going to be really critical. I just see the fixed penalty notices as an additional tool they can use.
Okay, thank you.
Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. I guess while you're here talking about fixed penalty notices and specifically linked to farming, I know there's interest in our National Rural Crime Officer from Police Scotland looking at 6-week limitations for accessing Conic Hill, part of the West Highland Way, which is through the Lomond Trossachs area. So limiting access with folk with their dogs, or mandating the dogs go on a lead in order to help reduce livestock attacks. And so is that something that are you aware of? Is that something that could be pursued? Because that would help, according to the rural crime officer that I spoke to, that might be something that would help address reducing livestock attacks during lambing time.
It's not something or a proposal that I'm aware of at the moment. It is something I would have to look at in more detail and give consideration to, again, just to consider what any implications of that might be. But I'm more than happy to follow up with you directly in relation to that, or to provide that information to committee if that would be helpful.
Okay.
Thank you. We've more or less come to the end of the questions on part 3. However, it's just to put on record, there are some additional amendments that may come forward which are on the back of the Galloway National Park or the process for proposing and designating a new national park, which would ultimately be brought forward as amendments to part 3. So just at this stage, I think it's probably more appropriate to bring up some of these suggestions or concerns around the existing Act in our next session, but could actually inform some of the discussions we have around our report on Stage 1 of the Natural Environment Scotland Bill. So I just thought I'd put that on record. But we'll come to the end of this section. I propose that we suspend for 10 minutes and resume at 9:50. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. Our third item on the agenda is an evidence session with the Cabinet Secretary regarding the decision not to proceed with plans to designate a Galloway and Ayrshire National Park. And I welcome back to the meeting Mary Goujon, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands, and our officials. We've allocated around an hour to discuss this item. So before we begin, can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement?
I don't have much further to add at this point, Convener. I'm happy just to move straight to questions if the committee would prefer that.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks very much. We'll kick off with Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Okay, so I wonder, Cabinet Secretary, if you can lay out the reasons why the Scottish Government has decided not to progress with the proposal for a Galloway National Park, and how and on what timeframes would alternative recommendations for the area will now be progressed. And like in the forefront of my mind, I'm thinking about Dark Sky Park, Forest Park, and of course the UNESCO Biosphere.
Well, I'd say, first of all, hopefully I was able to outline in my statement why we reached the position that we have when I announced that to Parliament a couple of weeks ago. We've been through quite an extensive process, the statutory process where we appointed Nature Scott as the reporter to advise on the proposal commenced in the summer last year. We received that report, and the main recommendation within that was that we do not proceed with the designation, but instead look to build on existing structures within the overall area. Nature Scott had outlined in the report the significant opposition that there was seen to the park. I mean, when we look to the overall figures from the consultation, I think 54% of people were opposed to the national park, 42% supported it, but when you consider the local responses of that alone, that rose to 57% of people were opposed to the designation of Galloway as a national park. I think there were a number of concerns that had been raised throughout the consultation process, which Nature Scott had detailed in their report too, and I know there were concerns from specific sectors about that to renewables, from agriculture, from the forestry sector, and think on the basis of the consultation that they had undertaken, that was their recommendation, and that was the basis on which we decided to proceed.
Okay, I'll stop there for now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There was one issue that came out probably above the rest. So there was issues raised about the time scales around the bidding process for organisations to come forward and the capacity within areas to actually deliver a bid, a successful bid, because there's no legislation around that at all. So it may be that we need to look at amendments to the existing National Park Act through the National Environment Bill to address that. There has certainly appeared in some areas to be an over-reliance on volunteers to bring forward the proposals, particularly in light that we heard in evidence that the Loch Lomond and the Cairngorms National Park, where the consensus or how the parks would be developed was formed over as long as 7 years, where businesses, locals, individuals, NGOs came together to look at how they would see a national park being developed. So that was a period of about 7 years, whereas in Galloway that timescale was significantly shorter. But as I say, one of the main issues was around Nature Scott providing the government with two separate and distinct roles. One was to give recommendations as a reporter to the consultation, and one also as the Natural Heritage Advisor to the Scottish Government. That obviously then led to a lot of people suggesting that Nature Scots were biased in their role as reporter, providing the Scottish Government professional advice as well as trying to carry out an effective consultation. So how did you weigh up that advice, trying not considering the two roles that Nature Scott have had, and would you consider again an amendment that would look to have an independent reporter involved in providing the consultation responses for future designations?
There is quite a lot to pick up on in relation to the points you've made, Convener, so I hope you'll allow me to try and address quite a lot of that. I think, well, touching on your last point first in relation to Nature Scot and the role as a reporter. Now, that's what's set out in the 2000 Act, and I think it's really important. And obviously, I received 2 sets of advice from Nature Scot, which are very separate and distinct. Advice from Nature Scot, which is distinct in their role as a reporter, based on the wide range of consultation they had undertaken and the views that they had heard, and the report they produced on the back of that. And then separately, we received advice from them based on their other role in relation to the other elements of the proposal, which are separate and distinct. Again, the role as a reporter, that's what's set out in the legislation. I think another really important report that was published at the time of my parliamentary statement the other week was from the Scottish Development Community Centre, where they commented specifically on the role of Nature Scot as a reporter, where they outlined, they were appointed as an independent, I think it's important to outline, they were appointed to independently assess the work that an engagement that Nature Scot had undertaken. And they felt that Nature Scot had managed to navigate the process with a commendable level of neutrality. They did highlight, and they picked up in that report, that there was criticism of Nature Scot, but they found that that would be expected in any high-profile public consultation. And they also noted that few other organisations would have had the capacity or expertise to manage that complex and large-scale exercise. And they said that they were the perfectly acceptable choice for the Scottish Government to choose as a reporter, given they're the agency operating on environmental issues. So I think it's important to outline that in that context. I think picking up on some of the other points... That
Sorry, just to make it easier for me as well as you, but whether the report suggested they did act in an unbiased way or as well as they could, right from the outset there was a perception that Nature Scot just simply couldn't be unbiased, because ultimately they promote and they have a huge role in the existing 2 national parks. So surely it would be more appropriate to choose a reporter with appropriate skills in conducting these types of inquiries or processes, where they could set out their recommendations independently of Nature Scot. That would have immediately taken away some of the suspicion that the process was right from the outset going to be biased. Whether ultimately the view was taken by the organisation that did the overview that they did act unbiasedly, that didn't matter to the people who right from the start thought it was. Is it not something you would consider to have an independent reporter in the future to take away that perceived bias?
Again, I'm not going to rule anything out, and I think it's important that we take... we consider the outcomes of the consultation and how we can improve and that whole process and how we can improve going forward. We've got to learn lessons from that, there's no question about it. But again, I'm following what's set out in the legislation. Yeah. You know, as a government minister, you would expect me to do that. But again, I do just want to come back to that. I appreciate that as a concern. It was raised with me early in the process, and I know directly raised by yourself, Convener. But I do think it's important to outline the process that Nature Scot had undertaken here, and to really recognise that it was a really significant undertaking, and I think that's where the independent assessment of that and the views of that as well are really important in outlining it. There were also other organisations that were brought in relation to the engagement exercise. So I think to have these findings, I think, really outlines that and the neutrality that they found, and I do think it's really important to highlight that work.
Okay, thank you.
And sorry, Convener, can I come back to
Certainly, yes.
Other points in relation to the process that you'd raised too, and notwithstanding the fact that you outlined the length of time the process took to designate our first 2 national parks in Cairngorms and Loch Lomond and the Trossachs. I would say that this has been a significant process. I don't think you would find the Galway National Park Association arguing that this had been a quick process. In fact, I remember meeting with the National Park Association when I was first appointed as a minister in 2018, and I know that they'd been building that campaign in that time. Now, of course, in 2021, we'd set out that we would be looking to establish a national park. We'd had a parliamentary debate in 2022 where there was broad parliamentary support for establishing another national park, and many members telling us to do that as quickly as possible, but also to designate more than one national park. And I do think that the process that was established on the back of that and put forward was really to be community-led. It was consulted on at various points as well, so I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that, or to suggest that this was a rushed process, because I think that the steps that were taken at each stage to consult, to make sure we had the appraisal criteria right, was all very important. Because, Convener, you did raise a really important point that while the process to designate a park is clearly set out in the National Park Act of 2000. The how to nominate process isn't outlined within that at all. So what we had tried to develop was really a process that would be built from the bottom up and really coming from communities themselves and bringing that forward.
Okay, thank you. Mark Ruskell.
So just on that process, I mean, at the point at which ministers formally propose a park, do you think that there should be like a firmer vision of the national park at that point? Because that currently is a bit ambiguous within the legislation, and obviously I think the attempt here was to try and get that discussion going locally. It's bottom up, it's been led by local people, but has that kind of worked? I mean, would it not be better in a way to sort of come with a much clearer vision at that point? And obviously the Act doesn't require that, it explicitly doesn't say that. But
and to be perfectly honest, I mean, I think it's the whole purpose of approaching it in the way that we had, in the way that Nature Scott had gone about their consultation as well, was not to go in with a fixed idea, because you want it to be built by the communities in Galway. But I also appreciate, and I think this was picked up in the Scottish Community Development Centre report as well, that by not having that led to, you know, it's harder for people to take a view on. And if people felt that they were against a national park, they were then less likely to engage in the other questions around that, about what the shape of that could be, or to consider alternative proposals. So that's where, again, touching on that, the Community Development Centre report is really important, because I think it brings out some of that and some of the challenges that we had with it. And I think from my perspective, I certainly did not want to go to any community and say, you know, this is a model. I think we then would have had accusations of, you've come and this is something you're going to impose on us. So it was really about how to try and get that balance, to ask the question, do you want this in your area? You know, you can help design it. So I absolutely appreciate that comes with difficulties on that approach, but that was the reasoning why we had set about it that way.
Yeah, it's difficult because you're asking people, do you want it? But then, well, what is it? Well, will you decide? So it's a tricky one. And then, you know, another point that's been raised with me just about guidance, about how a suggested area has to meet the criteria in the 2000 Act. So whether there needs to be a bit more guidance in there.
Again, I think having the flexibility to design the process, I mean, as much as that wasn't set out in the 2000 Act about how to go about the nomination, I do think the process that was established and the flexibility for us to design that process, I think that's been a really important exercise, actually, because there were various stages of consultation throughout 2022, 2023 to look at what the criteria might be, how we would appraise different groups on the back of that, looking then for the nominations from the groups. So I think that being able to design that, I think has been a positive through that process, and really trying to ensure that this was a bottom-up approach that was taken and something communities actually wanted. I think it's also really important to point out that within the appraisal process and throughout that too, that local support and having that local support was a really critical element of that was assessed through that appraisal process by the expert panel that we had to determine how we should move forward to the next stage and what groups we should proceed with.
Okay, thanks.
Rhoda Grant.
We have the Natural Environment Bill going through at the moment, so there is an opportunity with that to make amendments to that bill. So I wonder what lessons can be learned from the process that we might be able to reflect back in the Natural Environment Bill.
Well, I think there's probably quite a lot of lessons to be learned through this process. I don't think necessarily all of them are legislative or would require a legislative fix, but of course I'm more than happy to hear committees' views on that if they think that would be needed. Again, I think in terms of the reporting process and the independent assessment we have of that, I think that came out with some, it's come out with some recommendations about that engagement, or should we look to engage again, how we could improve on that going forward, which I think is really important, and we need to take that into consideration. But again, I think there have been benefits to the fact that we could, as I just outlined to Mark Ruskell, being able to have the flexibility to design a process for the nominations has been important too. But again, more than happy to take the views of members if they think there are any particular areas that need addressed.
Well, more about building local support. Obviously, in Galloway, that wasn't the case. But I was also very aware when the process was ongoing, the early stages of the process, there was lots of areas of the Highlands and Islands where people were trying to build support for that. And I was quite surprised, actually, at the pushback against. I thought people would be, and certainly when we were looking at legislating and people were talking about national parks going forward, there seemed to be kind of a head of steam wanting national parks, but then suddenly at that point there came quite a big pushback, and areas I thought would have been wanting them weren't. So how do we look at building local support and maybe dealing with local concerns? Because people were saying to me the board wouldn't listen to them. So is that a reflection on how boards, the two boards we have, are working at the moment? How do we kind of make that more open and get people involved and make people feel they have a voice, that they would want a national park?
I think there's probably a couple of separate issues within that, because you know, the issues that you can identify within the current national parks, as you just outlined there, as opposed to, you know, how we could look to build community support potentially in other areas at some point in the future. Because I think that's something that, you know, how can we legislate for that or to ensure that's there? I think it's about how we talk about our national parks, because I do think there was some misinformation around the campaign in terms of what some people felt a national park would impose, which wasn't necessarily always the case. I think there was some misunderstanding about what a national park in the area might mean, and I think people feeling that it could be a lot more onerous on them in terms of planning, as an example, when that needn't necessarily be the case, because of course there's the flexibility within the designation process to, you know, in relation to planning powers and what that might look like for a new area. So I think there are issues around that. I mean, in relation to the national parks themselves, I mean, I do think that just in the previous session when we were talking about the bill itself, I think the collaborative nature, I mean, I do understand that our national parks do some really tremendous work, and I think they deliver on a lot of the objectives that we would want to see, and I would hope that in each of our areas that we'll see a result of a lot of that collaborative work as well. But if there are particular concerns that, you know, people feel like they aren't being listened to, I mean, I would hope that the parks would look to try and address that where possible. I don't know if the member is referencing anything in particular, but I'd be more than happy to pick that up, or if there is a specific change in mind that you might have.
It just seemed, I suppose, reflecting back what people were saying to me, that the people that were looking to build consensus around the national park were not necessarily people that had kind of a community focus. So kind of groups who were obviously keen on having a national park, who maybe had aims and objectives that the community were aware of, and maybe didn't feel that reflected back on them. I think that didn't help. And I wonder if there is going to be a look at the mechanism to allow communities to come together to discuss this very openly without feeling that they're in a yes or no position, because I think that then immediately gets people to pick a side as to whether they want it or not, depending on their level of trust or mistrust of the organisation promoting it. It seemed to me that almost it was a no-go area for many people from the outset, just the way that putting forward a proposal was being handled.
It is challenging, because I do think with the nominating process that we'd gone through, and just as outlined in my previous comment to Mark Ruskell as well, a key element of that was about ensuring there was the local support, because obviously there's no point in taking a nomination forward if it didn't appear that there was a strong community backing for it. So I don't know if you mean that you want to make sure the community as a whole is represented, and perhaps some areas feeling like it wasn't their community that had been represented necessarily in that process. And again, that's why, and as part of the reporting process on the back of that appraisal, a key part of that was about, well, gauging the overall interest across the area and doing that really deep and wide consultation to see what people's views are. But again, I think that's where the nominating process itself is really important, and the appraisal for that, because, and as I say, that was key, and I think that was picked up in the appraisal, well, particularly of Galloway and some of the where there were all sorts of, I think they found that the local engagement and support for the proposal, was there to quite a significant and extensive extent, which is why they had recommended that could be one of the areas that proceeded to the next stage. So it's, again, if there are any particular suggestions from members as to improvements that can be made to that nominating and appraisal process going forward, then of course more than happy to consider that. But we did try to build that into the process to ensure that, the community engagement and support for that was there.
I think the community engagement was there. It was who was carrying out that engagement, I guess. Where are the trusted voices? The kind of, I think people felt that the moment someone was consulting them on this, it was a done deal. That was what the aim of the exercise was. So therefore people either took fright and said no, or were very positive about it. And some people were very positive, but it almost became trenched very early on. And it felt like there wasn't that open and honest conversation about what could this be, how do we shape it, what input will we have if we go forward with this. It almost felt we missed a stage at the very start before we started having the wider consultation.
Sorry, are you referencing the reporter stage and the engagement stages before it, that's the area that needs to be considered?
Yes, well, certainly, I mean, other members will know better about Galloway, but I was kind of very aware of the areas in the Highlands and Islands that were putting forward nominations. And I was very aware of what was happening there. And I felt that people were becoming very entrenched very quickly on their view, rather than having the opportunity to explore this without any pressure, what it would mean for them. Something earlier that would give people ownership of it, rather than feel that they had to make a decision very, very early in the process.
Again, I'd be keen to hear where, or I think, more detailed views on which part of the process should be changed, because I think the process that we had designed to take forward to get those nominations was very much designed with that in mind, to try and get that support. And we'd had another organisation to help support that nomination process within the areas, to support local groups to undertake that wider consultation and engagement work to discuss the proposal. So I would just be keen to get perhaps clearer views on which part of the process should have changed, or how we could have gone about that differently, because, as I say, it was very much designed to try and be bottom up, not imposing this on anyone. And that's what I think it was important to say to the communities across Scotland. If this is something you want in your area, come forward, do that engagement, and let us know if this is something you want to see, rather than the government saying that, choosing an area and saying this is what we're going to put forward in your area. But I do think there's that wider piece, probably touches on a point that Mark Ruskell had raised earlier too, about what a national park looks like, what a national park means, how it can be different. It's not a one-size-fits-all across the country. There is that flexibility there to design something that suits local needs, and better messaging around that. But again, I think the process we had established and put in place over the past few years was really about trying to get that community support. But of course, we've got to look back and see what lessons can be learned from that, as well as from the reporting process itself.
Okay.
Just on that, it did go horribly wrong It was, I don't think it's exaggerated to say it was a complete and utter disaster. And it has pitched community against community, and the whole process was very polarised from the outset. And you said that you failed to set out how it could be different. And I think that was one of the issues. Communities judged what a Galloway National Park would be on the 2 existing parks, but we're told, well, it can be different, it has to be different, and we're going to move on to that in a minute. The farm and forestry, renewables is completely different and at a different scale than elsewhere. But why did the government fail, or NatureScot fail, to actually set out how in practice it could be different? You know, because some of the concerns were about farmers will have some of their permitted development rights taken away. There'll be stronger regulations around commercial forestry. It will lead to far more low-paid jobs. It will lead to higher house prices. But we kept on saying, well, don't worry about that, because it's going to be different. It's going to be flexible. So why did the process fail in setting out how a Galloway National Park could be different? Because I think that's fundamentally why we find ourselves where we are today, because people just didn't understand how it could be different in practice.
To be fair, though, I think that we had all been at pains to try and explain that as well, both from a Scottish Government perspective, and I know that NatureScot had used obviously the official consultation had launched in November last year, but there was also the 3 months of engagement prior to that to exactly lay that groundwork and set out some of that as well, and to really try and clearly explain that, you know, if this is something that people in Galloway would like to see, then it can fit around the needs of the area, because I absolutely recognise the importance of agriculture there, the dairy industry, and it's about how a park would have, you know, supported that in the key industries that exist in the Galloway area. So again, I think that was very much part of the process, and it comes back again to Mark Ruskell's point about how you strike that balance between going in with something that is a clearer idea of what that could look like, without necessarily, without saying to people this is what is going to come to your area. It's trying to approach it that you don't want to be top down and go with an idea so that people then suggest that this is what you're going to implement and accuse you of forcing something on people they don't want. Again, any views on that I'm more than happy to hear. But the genuine approach to this throughout the whole process and from when it was established was about ensuring this was something communities wanted, that local people wanted to see in their area, and something they could design around that. We obviously have a number of recommendations from the Scottish Community Development Centre about the reporting process itself and improvements that could be made there, recommendations for the future as well that I think are really important for us to look at and seriously consider in any steps we take from here and moving forward. But of course, I want to hear the views from members as well about their experiences of it.
I know Mark and Emma want to come in, but I think it's appropriate at this point just to bring in Elena Whittam with her question, then I'll pick up the other supplementaries. Elena.
Thank you very much. Some of my questions have actually been touched on by the convener, but I think I want to set out from the get-go that the first I heard about the Galloway National Park was back in 2016. So, you know, we're going back 9 years. And I was a local councillor in East Ayrshire at the time, and I was part of that council when that council took a positive decision, in my view, to support the National Park back in 2018 after we did extensive public consultation ourselves on the back of what the Galloway National Park Association people were doing. What did happen, I think, is it ended up feeling like a bolt out of the blue for some sectors. So if we do think about farming, forestry and the renewable sector, it seemed to be that we got to a point where there was a galvanising happening in that sector to kind of all of a sudden realise this might have an impact on us, and you know, we haven't heard our voices in the mix as of yet. And I don't think anybody can apportion blame onto the Galloway National Park Association people for that, because they set out with their vision and took that vision out to people and consulted quite extensively since 2016. So I'm wondering, listening to everybody, all the other members around the table and yourself, how can we ensure that sectoral issues, which affects real people on the ground who are farming or who are part of forestry or renewables. How do we ensure in any proposals that come forward again don't get to this stage where it feels as if people do get entrenched? Because there was a groundswell of support, and then all of a sudden it got to a crunch point where it felt as if there wasn't. And I think some sectors felt as if they weren't being heard. So how do we deal with that? How do we not overcome those challenges from those sectors specifically to get to a positive conclusion?
I think it is that continued engagement with them as well throughout the process. And I know I've talked a lot about it today, but the Scottish Community Development Centre in their report I think is really important in setting out some of the issues that I think they saw with the process and how to potentially try and avoid similar situations occurring again in the future. And a lot of that is about recognising, I think one of the suggestions he had is about bringing together a local steering group early in the process as well that can help advise and help with some of that engagement and ensuring that there is that wider feed-in and people, as you say, don't feel alienated by the process, but they very much feel a part of the conversation and that it's not something that's being done to them. So I think there are a lot of points that were raised in that particular piece of work that I think we need to pay attention to, because I don't think any of us would want to end up in a similar situation, because I think we've got to be able to have these kind of discussions and debates, and with hopefully it not ending up in such a polarised way as what we've seen and what we've experienced with this, and we would certainly want to avoid that into the future.
Do you think as well, I mean, perhaps was there other things that were happening at the same time that ended up making this feel very kind of messy? So we've got obviously the Natural Environment Bill going through and the changes that we've just been speaking about in the previous question session, and also changes that are happening in terms of agricultural payments, and the convener made mention of permitted development rights maybe coming into question, etc. Do you think there was a lot going on and it just felt as if this would be something else on top, that the vision couldn't be actually seen?
Potentially that could be an issue, and I can appreciate that would be that potentially could be a concern for people. I think certainly from my perspective, and I think we've just had the session on the Natural Environment Bill, I mean the work that we're taking forward in agriculture certainly wouldn't be impacted by this and vice versa, because farmers will still receive their payments in the same way regardless of whether they're in or out of a national park area. And I do feel like with what we're proposing through the Natural Environment Bill, through the aims, I don't think that would have fundamentally altered the proposal that was being considered for Galloway either, or fundamentally changed that. But I appreciate from the outside looking in, and of course right across government, there is so much happening at the moment that potentially people could view it that way. But I think certainly from my perspective, that wouldn't have fundamentally altered the proposal that was being taken forward there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Emma Harper's got a supplementary, then I'll come to Mark Ruskell.
Okay, thanks. It's just to quickly look at within the consultation and the feedback, there were options of boundaries that were to be chosen. Option 1 was a smaller park area, and then option 2 and option 3 were bigger, wider. And I'm thinking about biosphere boundary, which has recently been expanded to cover the Rins of Galloway. So was there a significant input into the boundary choices or the proposal as part of the consultation? And I also just quickly pick up on what Eleanor Whittam was saying about other things going on, like the establishment of the regional land use partnerships and other issues with the Dark Sky Park and the Forest Park. And so there is a lot going on already. So just wondering about that in terms of feedback about the options that were being offered or provided in terms of boundaries and all the other stuff that's going on as well.
No, you're absolutely right in terms of the boundaries. I think Nature Scott had proposed that should ministers decide to designate, that they would have recommended the smaller core area as they outlined in their report in relation to that. And again, but between the different reports that came out, it was difficult, because I think Nature Scott outlined that too in their report, that obviously, if somebody felt like they were against a national park, it was then harder to get that engagement in terms of, you know, the different options of what that could look like, what governance it could look like, or what shape that would take. But the overall boundary choices had been informed by the engagement with local people and with other stakeholders around that too. But again, there are always going to be difficulties in relation to that. And sorry, can you remind me of your second point?
Just to pick up on what Eleanor was saying about regional land use partnerships and other activities going on, and you know, there were a lot of people that were definitely in support of the tourism economy, for instance, but then there's others in terms of, you know, the option that was shown, the smaller park, the core part, was didn't include the dairy farming parts, for instance, or some of them. So it's just interesting to me that what could have been proposed as the core park, we've ended up with no proposal at all, but there's all of this other things going on as well, which is what Eleanor was describing.
Well, absolutely, and I think that was identified in the report as well, and a key part of the other part of the recommendation from Nature Scot too is looking at the existing structures and mechanisms that exist in the area. There's the Natural Capital Innovation Zone, the work that SOCI are doing, Biosphere, as you mentioned, the Regional Land Use Partnership and framework on the back of that as well. So, and again, that's a key part of the recommendation, is about looking at the existing frameworks and mechanisms that exist in the area and really how to build on them going forward.
Okay.
Thank you. Mark Ruskell.
There were reports of some intimidatory tactics at the gallery meetings, particularly from those who were opposed to the park. I don't know what lessons can really be learned there in terms of how that public narrative plays out. And I think we did see some similar concerns in the earlier bid process around Scotland as well. There was some quite aggressive tactics. So I don't know what government's reflection is on that.
It's really concerning to hear that, and that was picked up by the independent facilitators who were undertaking that engagement work with Nature Scot as well, outside the box. That was identified by them, and some of the behaviour that they outlined that they saw at some of the engagement events. I mean, absolutely, that's not what we want to see. We should be able to engage, you know, just as I was saying earlier, we should be able to have a discussion and debate these points without seeing intimidatory behaviour like that, which is, you know, what they outlined, because people should feel free to be able to express their views, whether they're for or against. So again, the lessons to be learned in terms of we have the recommendations about how we can go forward. I think it comes back to that work, though, at an earlier stage, how we can try and prevent some of that polarisation from occurring, so that we can have that open and honest conversation about some of these really serious issues, and of course serious concerns that were identified through the consultation process as well, and you know, some really legitimate concerns that people have about issues they see in their area, but we need to be able to have that conversation in a constructive way and try and avoid the situation and some of the issues that we experience through this. So I think we've got to take those recommendations, reflect on them, and see ensure that we move forward positively. From here.
Do you think there's quite a heavy reliance on volunteers? I know that, you know, the volunteers that were working on the earlier bids, some of them went through, you know, quite a heavy cost in terms of putting their head above the parapet, proposing change. It feels like that's quite a vulnerable space for a lot of people to be really leading that change.
Yes, it can be, and I recognise just the sheer amount of work that the volunteers did in Galway, but also in terms of putting forward the other bids. I mean, I don't by any means underestimate how much work went into that and how much the capacity that would have utilised. I would say, though, we did try to support that, and we engaged other consultants to help support the nominating groups. I think recognising the burden that would put on them, and to ensure that we had really good quality bids that came forward for the appraisal process too. But yeah, I absolutely appreciate the difficulties that you raise and what that means for the volunteers and the onus that is put on them in relation to that. But again, I think it's important that we were able to support those nominating groups, but also it has got to be a community and led effort, I think.
Okay, so my next question really is about where the government goes next on that. You know, what is the policy now on national parks? And I note that, you know, there were two other bids, Loch Arbour and Tay Forest, which, you know, did meet the appraisal criteria, and certainly, you know, one of those bids, Tay Forest, the public consultation that was led by the local council, Perth and Kinross Council, extensive consultation, did show a large majority support for a national park in that area. Your earlier comments about the rejection of Galloway were really focused on the lack of public support. So you have one area which has public support, does meet the criteria. What would be the future for a national park in Tay Forest at this point? Because it appears to have everything on the table.
Well, I think we had selected Galloway from that list because it met all of the criteria that had been set out through that appraisal process. But I think I do just want to be clear that we set out a process to establish or to designate a new national park in Scotland. As far as I'm concerned, we have completed that process and we've come to a decision not to proceed with that designation. So I wouldn't want you to think that we're now going to reopen that or go back to consider other bids because, again, we've been through that process and that has been completed. So I won't be going back to review those bids or to consider proceeding on that basis. But I do think that generally, of course, we're open to considering establishing a national park potentially in the future, but that would be for a future government to determine how to take that forward. But I certainly wouldn't be reopening that process with the time that's remaining in this parliamentary session.
Okay. So that sounds like no more national parks then for Scotland for the foreseeable future, at a time when there are lots of national park proposals being developed in England and elsewhere.
Well, for the remainder of this parliamentary session, again, that would be a decision for a future government to take in the next session.
Okay. What about the issue of adjusting the boundaries of the existing parks? So certainly with the Tay Forest bid, it was situated in between two existing national parks. And there has been evidence brought forward to suggest that the existing national park boundaries don't easily fit with the geography of the area, or indeed a lot of the issues around economic development, tourism, regulation of the environment. Would the government be open to adjusting the boundaries of the existing two national parks, or is that off the table as well? I
mean, it's not a proposal that's been put forward to me or something I've been asked to consider. So, again, it's not something I'd be looking to consider at this stage. But if a proposal was to come forward, it was something that would have to undergo significant consultation and engagement as well. So, again, I've not been approached with that, so it's not something I'm looking to consider at the moment.
But it's something that came up through the discussions around the Tay Forest bid, because the boundaries would be contiguous with the existing two national parks. You do have communities that perhaps have a better understanding of what a national park looks like because they can look to their neighbours and see exactly what's happening. Would you be open to a conversation around that if, say, Perth and Kinross Council or others came forward and said, look, there is a case now to adjust the boundaries in some way?
I mean, if anybody wants to have that conversation with me, I'm more than happy to have it. But again, I can't make any commitments at this stage that that's something I'm looking to do because of the processes that would potentially be involved in that. But again, I haven't received a specific proposal in relation to that.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
It appeared right from the outset that the timescales over the designation of the Galloway National Park were going to be incredibly difficult, and that really the only work that had been done, whilst it was very commendable with the Galloway National Park Association for quite some time, before I was an MSP, that was something that was looked at. But it became clear quite early on in the consultation process that it was deeply flawed. Yet almost £350,000 was spent on this failed process. Was there not a point that you should have considered calling a halt to the process when it was so clear, even back in December, January of the turn of this year, that this was ultimately going to result in a very polarised and doomed process?
I don't think there would have been much point in stopping the consultation midway through. I think it was important for that exercise to reach its conclusion. So I wouldn't have agreed to a suggestion or a proposal to halt the consultation when it was only halfway through its established timeframe.
Okay, thank you. We've heard the Citizens' Participation in Public Petitions Committee recommended that there should be an independent review of national parks to inform future decisions. We heard that throughout the consultation, and you've touched on it yourself. There was misinformation around national parks about some of the challenges that the current national parks have. Wouldn't it be sensible to have an independent review of national parks, when we know at the moment they do have annual reviews, but effectively they mark their own homework? And whilst the government does have oversight of that, there is a lack of confidence that these reports actually reflect the true situation in national parks, and there are still questions over actually whether they deliver on their nature targets, whether they deliver for local communities. So would you consider an independent review, which I think if it had been in place prior to the Galloway National Park proposal, the arguments wouldn't have been quite so polarised, and we wouldn't have had accusations of misinformation leading people to their conclusions whether we should or shouldn't have a new park.
But I do think in some ways it's all very well with hindsight saying that just now, but I think, harking back to the parliamentary debate that had taken part in 2022, where every party in the chamber unanimously supported the fact that we were looking to establish another national park. There were no concerns raised at that point about an independent review, or they weren't delivering on their stated aims and objectives. So of course it wasn't something that was considered at that time. And I would, again, as I responded to the Petitions Committee as well, it's not something I'm looking to undertake at the moment, because I do believe our parks are accountable, they are transparent. I do believe that they deliver on their objectives too. And again, there is, as I've set out already, and I think I've said previously too, there is that oversight from ministers, but I think there's also a role for Parliament within that as well. And I think that if there were any concerns from Parliament, then of course the committee itself could undertake an inquiry into national parks. But I don't feel there's a particular need to review them at the moment, so it's not something I'm actively considering just now.
But it came very clear that the misinformation and the distrust was around some of the main issues. So house prices are higher, there's less affordable social housing, there's an impact on agriculture and forestry. The misinformation around whether renewables would be allowed to expand or would be more controlled in a national park. The very fact that misinformation was there would suggest there was no trust in the current situation when it comes to national parks and their performance. So an independent review would have given or taken away a lot of that doubt, a lot of the speculation, a lot of the fears right at the outset of the designation process. And I'm not quite sure why, Cabinet Secretary, you don't appreciate that, because that's what you've been telling us all along about the misinformation. So there is a lack of trust. And an independent review would certainly put that to bed, because the figures would be there, they'd be independently reviewed, and moving forward, if future governments were minded to designate, to be quite clear what the real picture is, because at the moment, whether they're producing annual reports, whether they're scrutinised by the government or potentially by this Parliament, that trust obviously doesn't exist.
I appreciate the points and the request for a review, but as I've already outlined, it's not something I'm actively considering at the moment as well. I think we've just been through this process. I believe that our national parks are accountable, they are transparent in terms of what they deliver there. Again, I think if Parliament wanted to do a deeper investigation into that, then of course that's within the committee's means. But again, we've been through this process, and it's not something I'm looking to consider at the moment.
So my final question, if that's the case, and national parks are performing as well as the government believes they are, and delivering what the government believed they set out to deliver, why was all that information allowed to influence the decision of the people in Galloway?
Sorry, are you talking about any misinformation in the campaign? Yeah,
so ultimately the decision of the people in Galloway appeared to be based on national parks not delivering, national parks actually curtailing the ability for areas to be economically sustainable. Again, the view was that it was a low wage, it just exacerbated the low wage economy, low skilled jobs, higher house prices, restrictions on agriculture. If that's not the case, why did that misinformation effectively succeed in persuading the majority of people in Galloway not to back a national park?
I mean, people have perfectly legitimate views and it's up to them to express it, and I'm not going to suggest otherwise, but I do think that in terms of outlining what a national park can do and deliver, that was very much part of the work that Nature Squad had undertaken in the pre-engagement that I talked about, and also in trying to be to really outline to people in the Galloway area that this was something that was entirely up to them to design, if it was something that they wanted to have in their area, and to provide that information as well.
Okay, thank you. I don't believe we've got any further questions, so that concludes our evidence session. So thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary and your officials, for your time this morning. We now move into private session and suspend the meeting for 5 minutes.